Our first speaker this morning is Dr Andrew Leigh, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer and the Federal Member for Fraser based in Canberra's north. Before entering politics in 2010, Andrew was a professor at the ANU's Research School of Economics. He previously worked as a lawyer, a researcher, and he was a senior trade advisor for the late Senator Peter Cook. Andrew is a published author, he has a PhD from Harvard, and he was Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister under Julia Gillard's leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr Andrew Leigh.
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy. You can see why we have this man as a regular MC in Canberra, one of the great public speakers in this great city. Can I, of course, acknowledge we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. To acknowledge a few of my parliamentary colleagues, Brendan Smith, Shane Rattenbury, and I understand Andrew Barr is here as well. Thank you all for coming along to what is a long-standing event. I understand we're coming up to 2 decades for this budget breakfast, and yet again this morning's event is a sellout. I mean sellout in the good sense rather than the bad sense, and I'm happy to come back to that theme later. Apparently you could sneak a little table on the back if you paid an extra $7, and if anyone wants to strike that arrangement, just see the organisers. Of course, I want to recognise CBC, IPA and the ICAA for your contribution to public policy. It's through conversations like these that we work to build a better Australia. And the economic conversation that surrounds a budget is, I think, a great opportunity to talk about not just the fiscal numbers, but also more fundamental questions about who we want to be. In considering this budget, I want to start with 3 stories. The first is Judy Hewitt. Judy is a woman suffering from an intellectual disability who struggles with her condition every day. She says, if I got taken off the pension today, it would be hard for me to live as a person with a disability. The second is Alan Blevin, a 47-year-old crane operator. Alan worked as a brickies labourer for more than 15 years before retraining as a crane operator. And he says, my left knee's already giving in because I'm bending down, loading gear from trucks and guiding cranes all day. But I can't afford to just stop. I have to keep paying the rent and bills. Alan says, there's no chance I'll be able to work until I'm 70. And the third story is of Sue Kwan, who has a 3-year-old daughter and a 19-month-old daughter. And she says, I think everyone should be entitled to healthcare and not have to worry about choosing between a doctor's visit and dinner for the kids. She said if she has to pay more to go take the kids to the doctor, she'd certainly stop and think about it. In considering this budget as a whole, I think it's worth laying out some simple facts, because after all, we can all have our own political opinions, but we can't have our own facts. The first is that Australia is one of just 3 advanced nations to have avoided recession when the global financial crisis hit. The worst global downturn since the Great Depression, and we didn't go into recession. And that means that about 200,000 jobs and tens of thousands of small businesses survived that would have gone to the wall if we hadn't done something about it. The second important fact is that as a result of that, Australia's debt load is around 1/10 of our national income, one of the lowest levels in the developed world. But worryingly, that's been increased quite significantly since the government came to office. If you compare the baseline election and fiscal outlook brought down during the caretaker period by the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance, with Joe Hockey's first budget update, Mr Hockey managed to double the deficit. And yet, in this budget, he hasn't been able to halve it again. So after doubling the 4-year deficit, this is a budget which doesn't bring the nation's books back to where they were when the government took over. And the final fact that I think is absolutely vital to think about when we're reacting to this budget is that Australia over the last generation has seen significant income growth, but also a significant rise in inequality. Earnings for the top 10% have grown 3 times faster than earnings for the bottom 10%. The top 1% income share has doubled and the top 0.1% income share has tripled. And in Australia today, the richest 3 people have more wealth than the bottom 1 million people. The contents of a single automobile contain more wealth than the population of Adelaide. And so it particularly worries me that this is a budget that I think might widen the gap. For the most disadvantaged, there's cuts to healthcare and cuts to education. It's a budget which will be particularly harsh on young unemployed, and that's where young is defined as anyone under 30. Maybe that's reassuring to some of those some of you in the room to discover that Joe Hockey still thinks you're young. Possibly not so reassuring for a 29-year-old who loses their job. There's cuts for student assistance, and for the world's poorest, there's significant cuts to Australia's assistance. Australia's aid saves lives through vaccinations and sanitation, but we're going to save fewer lives as a result of the $16 billion cut to overseas aid. And yet at the top end, if you put aside relatively small measures such as the change to top levels of taxation, it's a budget which contains big tax cuts for mining billionaires, among the world's richest people. And it's a budget which continues the government's policy not to tackle multinational debt shifting. And amidst all that, Australians, I think, are now comparing this budget with the pledges that Mr Hockey took to the last election. It really is a case of find the promise that's been kept rather than find the one that's been broken. A surprising irony, given the strength with which Mr Abbott and Mr Hockey campaigned on being a team that would keep their promises. So whether you're an ABC lover, somebody who believes in investment in health and education, someone who believes that it's important for governments to keep their promises on taxes, you'll be disappointed at the level of broken promises here. Finally, for Canberra, this is going to be a pretty tough budget, and some of us have just been talking about this beforehand. I think as much as anyone else, Canberrans were entitled to think that the pretty tough promises that the Liberal Party campaigned on the last election of 12,000 public service job cuts would be the upper limit of what was done. But yet, now we're looking at 16,500 public service job cuts. And that's in an environment in which the number of public servants per head in Australia didn't increase since 2007. And our public service is ranked as about average in size across developed countries and above average in effectiveness and efficiency. I think budgets have to be about laying the ground for future prosperity. And for Australia's future prosperity, that means productivity growth. We do that by investing in infrastructure. Roads, yes, but public transport as well. And a national broadband network that brings fibre to the home and allows small IT businesses to be able to work from home. and a budget which invests in education and recognises that skills are going to be fundamental for a young school leaver making it in the labour market of the future. School leavers now will be in the labour market right up to the 2060s, 2070s. And so they've got to have first-rate skills, which means great investment in schools and in universities. And if we don't lay that groundwork for prosperity, then productivity growth in the future will be sapped. Education isn't just a great equity policy, it's a great growth strategy as well. I'll finish with a story. Yesterday, a 48-year-old woman from Canberra's north emailed me. She lost her job a couple of years ago and she's been unemployed. And her husband, who's 52, just found out recently that the agency he's in is going to be cut. They've got 2 girls in Catholic schools and they struggle to pay the mortgage on their 3-bedroom home in a modest suburb in Canberra. They're not rich by any stretch of the imagination, they're just getting by. But she wrote to me and you could sort of sense the real fear coming out of the page about what their family will do if her 52-year-old husband loses his job, how they'll then pay the mortgage, how they'll then keep their girls at school. Cuts to public service aren't just damage to the institutions that got us through the global financial crisis and that respond, for example, to the Queensland floods. They're cuts that hurt individuals like this woman from Canberra's north and their family. And I do worry for many of my constituents when I see the strategies laid out in this budget. Thanks very much and look forward very much to your questions.